Welcome back, AP. We are continuing with the Civil War. This is chapter 21. The key concept for this chapter and for chapter 22 will be key concept 5.3, focusing on the Union victory and some of the issues involving Reconstruction. A lot of key terms in this chapter, as well as people to know. President Abraham Lincoln concluded that an attack on a smaller Confederate force at Bull Run would be worth trying. If successful, the victory would show the superiority of the Union arms and might eventually lead to the capture of Richmond, which was the Confederate capital. On July 21st, 1861, the Union and Confederate forces met. A Union victory was thought to be for sure, as evident when spectators showed up. The Confederates won as Stonewall Jackson held his line of Confederate soldiers until reinforcements arrived. There are going to be lots of maps in this presentation, and I'm just going to click through them, but you can pause the presentation and look over the maps for each of the battles that are discussed. George McClellan. In 1861, General George B. McClellan was given command of the Army of the Potomac. He was considered meticulous in his planning, although he had poor implementation, and he only served as the general for 4 months. The Peninsula Campaign. Starting the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan's army launched a waterborne attack in the spring of 1862. The Union goal was to avoid Confederate army in Virginia by using the waterways to sneak up and capture Richmond. They came within sight of Richmond and attacked Stonewall Jackson. General Robert E. Lee launched a counterattack against the Union forces, and this was known as the 7 Days Battle, from June 26 to July 2nd, 1862. And the Confederates were able to drive McClellan's forces back to the sea. The Northern military had a plan that contained 6 parts. The first part was to slowly suffocate the South by blockading its coast. The second was to liberate the slaves and undermine the very economic foundation of the South. The third was to cut the Confederacy in half by seizing control of the Mississippi River. The fourth, to dismember the Confederacy by sending troops through Georgia and the Carolinas. The fifth, to capture the capital at Richmond, Virginia. And the sixth, to try everywhere to engage the enemy's main strength and grind it into submission. The 7 Days Battle again took place against the Union and the Confederacy, Lee leading the Confederacy, McClellan leading the Union, and it resulted with 36,000 casualties. The War at Sea. The northern sea blockades were concentrated at the principal ports in the South. The blockade was the chief offensive weapon of Britain. Britain did not want to tie its hands in a future war with the United States by insisting that Lincoln maintain impossibly high blockading standards. In order to combat the strong blockades, ships were developed to run through them. Some fast ships had the capability of running through blockades in order to make profits transporting cotton. These ships were able to break the blockades up until the latter part of the war, when the blockades were finally strengthened. In 1862, the Confederates created the Merrimac, renamed the Virginia. It was an old United States wooden ship that was plated with metal armor. It was a great threat to the northern blockades because it had the ability to crush through the wooden ships. On March 9, 1862, the Union ironclad, the Monitor, and the Confederate Merrimac met and fought to a standstill, or a draw. The Second Battle of Bull Run took place from August 29th through the 30th in 1862. It was General Lee of the Confederacy versus General Pope of the Union. It was the first major offensive battle by the Confederacy, with them ultimately being victorious in this battle. You can see that the Union suffered heavy losses while the Confederacy's loss was minimal in this battle. Some of the logistics of the battle: Stonewall Jackson captured Union supplies, which severed the link with Washington, D.C. The Confederate and the Union stalemate at Stony Ridge. General Longstreet of the Confederacy met up with Stonewall Jackson after meeting some light resistance. Pope was unaware that Longstreet was coming in to support Jackson and continue to fight Jackson, and the Union was easily defeated. The Battle of Antietam. It was the first major battle on northern soil. After General Lee crushed McClellan's forces in Richmond, Lee moved northward. On September 17, 1862, McClellan managed to halt Lee's forces after his forces discovered Lee's battle plans. Although not a victory, the Union stopped the Confederate march northward. Antietam provided Lincoln with the military backing to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was issued on January 1st, 1863. Lincoln now made the Civil War a war to end slavery because it declared that the rebels could not experiment for 10 years trying to destroy the government, and if they fail, still come back to the Union unhurt. The Confiscation Act of 1862 punished traitors by declaring their slaves property of war who shall be free. It was, however, not enforced in the border states. Those are the states that still had slaves but chose not to secede from the Union. And it removed the chances of negotiation between the North and the South. The Emancipation Proclamation called for the freeing of all slaves, although it did not actually free them. Lincoln did not even enforce the freeing of slaves in the border states for fear that they too would secede. The proclamation fundamentally changed the nature of the war because it effectively removed any chance of negotiation between the North and the South. And it gave the North a much stronger moral cause. It had to preserve the Union and free the slaves. After the battle at Antietam, Lincoln replaced McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac with General A.E. Burnside. But due to Burnside's massive defeat at Fredericksburg, Virginia on December 13, 1862, he was replaced by General Hooker. During the battle at Chancellorsville, Virginia on May 2nd through the 4th in 1863, Hooker was badly beaten, but not before Jackson was mortally wounded. Hooker was replaced by General George G. Meade. As Lee moved his Confederate forces to the north again, this time to Pennsylvania, he was met by Meade's force at Gettysburg on July 1st through the 3rd in 1863. The failure of General George Pickett's charge enabled the Union to win the battle. President Jefferson Davis was planning to deliver negotiators to Washington, D.C. with the Confederate victory at Gettysburg. Since the Union won the battle instead, Lincoln did not allow the negotiators to come. Some of the politics of war. The Congressional Committee on the Conduct of War found that there were some abused powers during wartime. This was led by Salmon P. Chase, who was Secretary of the Treasury. The Democratic Party split between War Democrats, who were pro-Lincoln, and Peace Democrats, who were anti-Lincoln. And then on the other side, you have the Copperheads, who were radical Peace Democrats. The war in the West. Ulysses S. Grant was started out as a Union volunteer. He was able to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February of 1862. He then moved to capture the junction of the main Confederate North-South and East-West railroads in Mississippi. His plan was foiled when he was defeated by a Confederate force at the Battle of Shiloh on April 6th and 7th in 1862. General Grant was given command of Union forces attacking Vicksburg. The city fell and surrendered on July 4th, 1863. Due to back-to-back Union military victories at the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg, all Confederate hopes for foreign help were lost. General Grant won the battle at Chattanooga, and the state of Tennessee was cleared of Confederates. Grant was made general-in-chief due to this win. The invasion of Georgia was left up to General William Tecumseh Sherman. He captured Atlanta in September of 1864 and burned it in November. He destroyed rail lines and burned buildings. He continued through Georgia with the main purpose of destroying supplies destined for the Confederate Army and to weaken the morale of the men at the front by waging war on their homes. Sherman captured Savannah on December 22, 1864, and he moved up through South Carolina, capturing and burning Columbia on February 17, 1865. The election of 1864. Fearing defeat, the Republicans joined with the War Democrats to form the Union Party in the election of 1864. Lincoln's running mate was Andrew Johnson, a local War Democrat. The Democrats, including the Copperheads, nominated General McClellan as their presidential candidate. The Northern Democrats lost the election of 1864. This was one of the most crushing losses suffered by the South. The removal of Lincoln was the last hope for a Confederate victory. The war ends on April 9th, 1865, with General Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, following the Wilderness Campaign. The war death totaled at approximately 600,000 and cost approximately $15 billion. President Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, was sworn in as president.